So let's start. Let me welcome you again at our conference. We have two more insights into this complex and complicated image of avant-garde theater and its past and present and future. And let me welcome here Justyna Michalik, who will present us a paper or a presentation about Tadeusz Kantor. Justyna has been focusing on Kantor since her university studies. She cooperates regularly with Cricot in Krakow, and she also published a book about Kantor in context of happening, and she's an independent researcher. So Justyna, the floor is yours. And her paper is called Avant-Garde in the Avant-Garde, which is a title that leaves very much space for curiosity, so I'm really curious about your presentation.
Thank you for introduction. So, it was Tadeusz Kantor himself who so far told the most about the relations of his art with the 20th century avant-garde. He openly admitted his fascination with Dadaism, Surrealism, abstraction, constructivism, the art of Bauhaus, and other avant-garde currents. In his writing, he explained the causes of these fascinations and their influence on his work, and critically commented them from the perspective of time. He felt a spiritual heir of the avant-garde and a creative successor of its ideas. Existing, albeit paradoxically still incomplete, writings by other authors indicate some points of contact of Kantor's art and avant-garde achievements, both in the formal aesthetic area and in the space of ideas. Among the creators of Polish theatrical avant-garde, the most often mentioned artist in this context, alongside Witkacy and Józef Jarema's Cricot Theatre, is Andrzej Pronaszko, undoubtedly one of its prominent representatives, painter and set designer, co-creator of Polish monumental theatre. Kantor called him the father of choice and had absolute acclaim for him. Researchers seeking for Pronaszko's inspiration in Kantor's work, on the one hand, bring up direct borrowings, replicas of concepts or solutions in set design, and on the other hand, stress similarities in the ways of thinking about the theater by these artists. Integrity of a theatrical work, seen in the concurrence of text and set design, treating the costume as a sculpture, and particular vigilance given to the speciality of the stage, are issues of matter for both of the artists, often underlined in analysis. These matters were, of course, also of consideration for other representatives of Polish interwar theatrical avant-garde. The new theater of the future, which they strived to establish, was to be in principle a negation of the roles of the proscenium stage in force in the previous epoch. It was intended to reject mimicry or naturalism and evade causal continuity of the plot. Theater was meant to emancipate into a form of art, governed by its own set of rules and regulations, arising solely from the shape of the theatrical space and desired communication situation with the viewers. Activities leading to the realization of such a vision of theater took various forms. One of the most spectacular and radical was the project of the simultaneous theater, fancied and designed by Pronaszko. Surprisingly, any mention of this project is impossible to find in the above-mentioned sources looking into relations of the two artists' work. In my opinion, we can perceive Kantor's happening theater as at least referring, if not drowning, continuing the idea of the simultaneous theater. Pronaszko stated in a publication titled Rebirth of the Theater that to effectively adapt the theater to the requirements of modern life, it is crucial to conquer in some sense the relation between the proscenium stage and the amphitheatric auditorium in the building of a traditional theater. In such an arrangement, the stage becomes essentially a one-surface picture decorated with, as he called it, paintings for theater. He stressed that the proscenium stage generates by itself spatial contradictions, as it is the auditorium and not the stage as one might expect, that is a diversified space in terms of both height and depth. Moreover, by producing the effect of theatrical illusion, the stage completely bars any communication or establishing a relationship between the actors and the audience, or, as we would say today, the operation of performative mechanisms. These, on the other hand, were what Pronaszko cared about most. Sorry. Attempts to evade two-dimensionality of the stage can be already identified in his Pronaszko's set design proposals based upon architectural construction of the stage scenery and the costume, clear differentiation of areas of the acting space through platforms, stairs, and ramps, and building artful relations between them which allowed the introduction of simultaneity of the plot and watching the events from multiple perspectives. And another photo. And I have already mentioned Pronaszko's architectonic and spatial concept of the simultaneous theater, co-created with architect Szymon Syrkus in 1928. Its main postulates were unity of the theater space, simultaneity of the plot, flexibility of the stage, and penetration of the audience into the stage. The concept preserved the division of the space into the stage and the audience, but proposed a different spatial arrangements of the elements. A small proscenium stage was to be complemented with two movable rings running across the central area of the acting space and surrounding the stationary amphitheatric auditorium. These rings, moving in arbitrary directions and with changeable speed, equipped with trapdoors and smaller rotating stages, were supposed to be the main acting space. Storerooms and wardrobes would have been placed behind the auditorium, and also there the plastic forms making up backdrops for succeeding scenes would have been placed on the rings. The rotation of the rings would then have brought the sets and actors into the audience's view angle. On the other hand, performing the plot in this dynamic space was meant to imply the movement of life and the lack of the elevation of the stage, and the simultaneity of gestures, sounds, and appearance of set forms in composition presented to the audience should construct a modern spectacle. Pronaszko returned to the concept of simultaneous theater in 1935 with the design of the moving theater, prepared in cooperation with draftsman Stefan Bryła. This time, the project proposed a movable auditorium completely surrounded by a stationary stage. In an article describing the project, we can read, "The moving theater is a combination of the stage and the audience into one aggregate. The rotary auditorium moves the spectators from one place of the action to another. There is no curtain, instead blackout or illumination of the place of the action is used, or several places at the same time, which provides the effect of simultaneity of events." These radical projects of autonomous form of theatrical space, seeking for new relations between stage and audience, reminded at the stage of unrealized ideas. After World War II, also Tadeusz Kantor strived to achieve autonomy of the theatrical work. He wrote about himself, "He has seen the prospect of avant-garde in Cricot too in a strictly theatrical realm, in the emancipation of theatrical work, the spectacle, from its role subordinated to the literary text. And although he based his actions on dramatic text, for a long period these were Witkacy's text, he meant to create a total theater where the traditional hierarchy of the elements of the spectacle is suspended. A theater where the logic of the text and the logic of the stage coexist independently. For various reasons, he showed his performances in non-theatrical spaces, mainly cafes or art galleries. It allowed for black box-alike arbitrary arrangements of the space of the stage, basically each time fresh and following specific needs and ideas resulting from his artistic quests, often also encompassing ideas stemming from visual arts. And in the realm of visual arts, he found an excellent tool in the fight against theatrical illusion, namely the neo-avant-garde concept of the happening, which stemmed from the postulate of total destruction of the traditional painting or even the work of art in general. In brief, happening was spontaneous activity, formally open and eclectic, utilizing real environment and putting a lot of emphasis on the participants' activity with intention of blurring the border between life and art. Kantor's radical gesture stemmed from his attempt to combine in one spectacle those two contradictory conventions, theater and happening. The realization of this contemplation was the staging of the Water Hen by Witkacy. Kantor was aware of avant-garde nature of this project. In one of the interviews, he said, "I began to work on the Water Hen absorbed in the idea of movement. I was tempted to do the Water Hen as a happening in theater. Yes, I know it's impossible. Happening and theater, things quite opposite by nature." The premiere of the Water Hen took place in a real space, the Café of Galeria Krzysztofory in Kraków. Wooden barriers, which in Kantor's intentions should form some kind of divisions, were set out at random amid the tables and benches occupied by the audience. Thus, the traditional fixed border between stage and audience was strongly compromised, and its possible existence was only faintly implied. After all, the spectators paid a visit to a café, and authentic waiters, hired by Kantor, realized their orders for coffee or wine. It was not clear at all to which reality the waiters belonged, the real café or Kantor's performance. Moreover, the moment the performance began was not clear either. Actors already dressed in costumes approached the spectators from time to time asking, "Has it already begun?" Obviously, it was comic element of the performance, but it also showed the liquidity of the formal convention and blurred rigid borders, and that was very important for Kantor. Kantor built the spectacle around, as he called it, the idea of travel, which was manifesting itself mainly in costumes and props of the characters and in the development of the action of the stage. Actors dressed in costumes of tramps and beggars, lugging enormous bundles and suitcases, cruised around the tables occupied by the spectator. They were constantly moving from place to place, doing mostly trivial activities taken from the happening convention. The dominant impression was total chaos. Basically, no single linear action could be identified. The spectators had to keep track of many activities performed in parallel, and it depended solely on them what they would focus on. At moments, the actors leaving their roles spoke directly to the spectators. There were also moments when individual persons from the audience were drawn into the action, made to participate by doing some activities assigned to them. It seems that by the introduction of the happening convention, Kantor received the unity of theater space, simultaneity of the plot, flexibility of the stage, and almost literal penetration of the audience into the stage. Basically, the ideas Pronaszko and Circus had in mind. In 1958, in the text Toward the New Speciality of the Stage, Pronaszko sadly stated that despite all theatrical avant-garde development and technical progress, the creators still remain in the space of the traditional proscenium scene. Beyond this space, our courage and inventiveness had no strength to get through, he wrote. At the end of the text, he asked, are we really going to stay for centuries in these horrors? And will we never get the collective effort to creating a new, rational theatrical space coeval with the Sputniks? And he answered himself, it seems that really never. Kantor was aware of the failure, at least in certain sense, of the pre-war theatrical avant-garde. On numerous occasions, he expressed his beliefs that World War II completely compromised the dreams of a new, better world, and in this way also of new theater. During one of his meetings with the audience in the 80s, he said it straight. The idea of constructivists went bankrupt. Above all, the politics they wanted to sign up to went bankrupt. That each subsequent age make one step forward, that means is better than the former one. Thus I ask, okay, but what will be at the end? Paradise. Well, we didn't see the 20th century to reach paradise, despite constructivism at its beginnings. Pronaszko's simultaneous theater concept was in fact close to the postulates of constructivism. It would be difficult to expect Kantor to directly refer or even pick up anew the ideas of his artistic mentor. Besides, this kind of univocal continuation would not be his style. If he was already intentionally drawing on someone's work, the reference was always filtered in some sense through his own artistic sensitivity, revamped and used for his own artistic objectives. And maybe it was for these reasons that he never dealt with theater architecture in the literal sense. This might also be the reason for his fascination with the happening, which he used to accomplish similar goals for which Pronaszko designed his simultaneous theater. Kantor knew exactly that mixing happening and theater is impossible. Despite that, he realized the spectacle as if he wanted to confirm his beliefs in praxis, and the hypothesis can be risked that just like Pronaszko, he suffered a failure. The border between stage and audience, or in other words, art and life, could not be defeated. Both spectators and reviewers interpreted the spectacle as just a theatrical performance complemented with happening-like elements that on the one hand were quite dangerous as they required personal active involvement of the spectators, but on the other hand, leading to a quite light reception concentrated on the amusing nature of the participation. That's probably why Kantor officially abandoned the happening theater. It doesn't mean the idea of overthrowing the fourth wall stopped to be tempting for him, although he already knew that so special rearrangements in the theater hall and classic participatory mechanisms do not lead to the desired results. His next spectacle, The Lovedies and Dovedies, comprised another step in this direction, but already on a different level. Kantor seemingly preserved the clear division of the space into the stage and the audience. While entering the room, the spectators were subject to selection in two groups, which had different tasks to do in the performance. Some of the spectators got wooden plates with numbers, and then during the performance, they were dressed in costumes of Mandelbaums and were subject to an obligatory muster. Other viewers sat on benches. At the necks of viewers from the first row, aprons were hung with painted, invasive, disciplining slogans similar to those hanging on the walls all over the room. And there is Sean Connery in first row. Thus, the spectators became either extras or parts of the set, and audience in classic sense simply did not exist. This paradoxical this paradoxically meant that the performance could not be played without the presence of the audience. Zbigniew Gostomski, Kantor's actor, told me in an interview several years ago that Kantor was always afraid that not enough viewers would come to fill all the places. He also recalled the problems during a closer show for the wife of the Shah of Iran, when for security reasons random Iranians could not be allowed to enter. The audience was thus annexed in a non-obviously way, so that from the formal point of view it did not exist, although it was physically present and separated from the space of play, just like in the old days. Another step can be seen in the dead class. If we follow the valid research consensus in the analysis of this spectacle, we must assume that its main theme is the tragedy of the Jewish during World War II. The audience is separated from the space of play by a thin cord suspended on small structures symbolizing the classroom's corners. The cord is at the same time impassable and fragile, easy to tear, and does not hide anything from one's eyes. A hypothesis can arise that the audience in the spectacle is something more than merely spectators of a theatrical performance, that the spectators in some way also pose themselves, the society, Polish, but not only Polish indeed, looking at the Holocaust with fear, helplessness, but also perhaps without emotion or even with satisfaction. This topic was taken up in Polish literature both earlier and later. Nevertheless, at the time of the premiere of the Dead Class, it was centrally absent in the public awareness. The audience perceived this way would become another collective character of the drama. Kantor used to say that he found inspiration of his theater in his memory and his history. Most the researchers deduce from this statement that his theater was only intimate and autobiographical. Nonetheless, his experiments with demarcation and demolition of the borders of a theatrical work, in a sense, led to a new solution, albeit not constructivist in their nature, based not on architecture and revolution in spatial order, of which he knew, maybe also due to Pronaszko's example, that they were ineffective, but on the logic and philosophy of the performance. And inspiration for them were not Pronaszko's Sputnik, but actual dramas of modern times, using black boxes, while maintaining the physical division convergent with classical solutions. He de facto disassembled it in the mental space of performers and viewers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justyna. I think her presentation brought up new interesting aspects. It's the turn of the relationship, avant-garde relationship towards the audience, and also like the legacy of the historical avant-gardes in the later periods and in the inspirations that showed up in Kantor's theater. And now we are moving to Grotowski, which cannot, I think, be omitted in this context. And and the one who will be speaking about Grotowski and his relationship or some inspirations by avant-garde is Dariusz Kosiński, who you know already very well, and without whom we wouldn't be here today, and who was for some time who also worked in Grotowski Institute for some time and focused on Grotowski in his research, and who is a teacher at Jagiellonian University, professor at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, and I let you.
Thank you so much.
Tell us about
we joked today in the morning with Justyna that it's dangerous to have panel including both Kantor and Grotowski. But last week I did something more dangerous. I put the slide with Grotowski's and Kantor's faces beside each other. And we finished this discussion saying that, yes, this is the thing to be crossed. We should stop all these jokes about the, let's say, conflict between the two artists, because they have many things in common. And as you see in a minute, we both use the same examples, so some slides will be the same. But I will start with something that you already knew very well. I think that all of you know that Jerzy Grotowski was one of the most important revolutionary figures of theater of the second part of the 20th century, the creator of such famous performances as Acropolis, The Constant Prince, and Apocalypsis Configuris, the only three performances that were presented abroad. The rest were only performed in Poland. He is, of course, famous for his work with actors, and it should be recalled at the time, in 1970, Grotowski said that he would never work on any other theater performances. So we need to remind ourselves that Grotowski was working as an artist from, let's say, 1950-70 to his death in 1999. So it's 42 years, yeah, am I right? Yeah, I think so. And only 12 years, let's say 13 years, he worked in a theater of productions. The rest of his time, he did something else. In the 70s, he proposed a kind of experiences that he called para-theater, and later he worked on the special performative structures that he called the actions. And this is a very, very strange thing. He is still working on it, because the work center of Jerzy Grotowski and Thomas Richard is still active in Pontedera and around the world, and they didn't change the name. So still the work center of Jerzy Grotowski and Thomas Richard is there. And this is, let's say, the most obvious points of Grotowski biography and the narrative that I would call anthropological, with the focus on Grotowski's work with and on the art of actors. And of course, this is the thing that made Grotowski most famous around the world, creating the fiction of so-called Grotowski's method. Everybody knows that there is something like Grotowski's method. In fact, it's not. Such things is not existing. So as one of the Polish poets, Zbigniew Herbert, once wrote, it's a most beautiful things, because the most beautiful thing is the one that is not existing. This Grotowski method obscures other achievement of Grotowski. The achievements are innovations, especially in the field of space dramaturgy and the relations between the actors and viewers and spectators. Also, his experiments with dramaturgy in a wide sense of the word. And what I'm going to try to do today is to make, let's say, some links or some bridges between these experiments and innovations and achievements of Grotowski in these aspects of his work and Polish theater avant-garde. It's not to say that Grotowski was indebted in Polish theater avant-garde or he was inspired. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But the most important thing that I believe needs to be done is to put Grotowski in some other context than this anthropological one. I feel, especially in Poland, everybody are fed up with this anthropological narrative. All these repetitions that Grotowski was looking for, the total act and transformation, and so on and so on and so on. I was also the one who was doing this. If we don't stop, the people will say, no, come on. As my students are saying now, no more. Let's say, stop it. Don't show us Apocalypsis Configuris. No. We don't want it anymore. So maybe it is a good idea to think about the performances that no one watched outside Poland and that are under research, in my opinion, and there we should look for some other connections. Grotowski himself, with one exception, never admitted that he is somehow linked to the interwar theater avant-garde, of course, with an exception of Reduta, created by Juliusz Osterwa and Mieczysław Limanowski. When Grotowski was asked what his ancestors, let's say, or his tradition is, he always said, Reduta is my tradition in the ethical sense of a work. Reduta is not strictly the avant-garde company, so they did some avant-garde work. But what I try to prove is that there are many hidden links and there are many interesting analogies between Grotowski's work and the work of Polish theater avant-garde. Let's start with something that is quite well known and commented upon. So we are going to the theater of architect, because this man, Jerzy Górawski, is a very successful Polish architect who was Grotowski's collaborator between 1960 and 1969, something like that. For the last performance by Grotowski, Apokalipsis Configuris, had no space arrangement, special space arrangement for. So Górawski was working with it, but not in a strict sense. After Grotowski left theater, Górawski organized his own architectural company in Poznan, and he was very successful, and he's still very successful. His business is flourishing, and he is a very lovely man, and I hope that someday you will meet him. He tells great stories. He makes a lot of mistakes. He doesn't remember facts. And what's most funny, he always draws the same projects of Grotowski's performances. So if you have in your collection a drawing by Górawski, don't be so sure that it's an original drawing from 60s. It's probably from 90s or even from the 21st century. When they first met in 1960, Górawski has been graduated from the technical university in Craców from the architectural department, and during his studies he got interested in theater and tried to design his own theater of the future. In his diploma work, he analyzed theater from the perspective of the experience of a spectator. His main idea was that the spatial relations shaping this experience are connected not only with seeing, but also with other senses, and that theater should be a multisensory effect as well. And now I will try to quote from Górawski. No, it's again. I think that the space is influenced by light, color, sound, and movement, and by the sphere that I regarded as the most essential and the most magical, that is, by the space of intuition that surrounds a person beyond the field of sight. It's another translation. Górawski himself admitted that his discovery, let's say, presented in his diploma work, was very simple. That you are not able only to see, but you should use other senses. But when you think about theater strictly connected with seeing, the word theater is from Greek verb thea, to see. You can think that it's that this change from seeing into some multisensory experience may have some revolutionary potential. It meant the shift from focusing only on what is positioned within the visual field of the audience towards the inclusion of, and this is a quotation from Górawski, what is behind the spectators, what is mysterious, but can nevertheless be sensed. Working from this basic assumption, Grotowski designed what he called an ideal theater with opposing auditoria, a central stage and backstage area that surrounds the stage. This is the sketch showing this, and as you see, it's very simple because there is a central stage, there is a place for the audience, and there is this, let's say, backstage. So there is a ring surrounding the audience behind the back. Grotowski understood it simply as the space for actions that cannot be perceived by sight, but are felt with other senses, making the spectator, or rather non-spectator, uncertain and destroying his stereotypically safe position. What's more, and what was quite important for Grotowski at the time, the spectators were not only exposed to what was out of their sight, which challenged them to employ other forms of perception, but they saw each other and were seen at the same time. And now there will be some repetition of slides, because Grotowski himself admitted that this idea was inspired by the projects of interwar avant-garde architects, Helena and Szymon Syrkus, and of course stage designer and painter Andrzej Pronaszko. And now I will just quickly skip the two slides that you've seen before. And Justyna told about simultaneous theater and the moving theater, so you know what it is about. The only thing that I would like to add is that these projects by Pronaszko, both versions of simultaneous theater, has also the potential of playing with subconscious, not by watching in silence the linear chain of subsequent actions, but by attacking the viewer with many factors and attractions at the same time, immersing her or him into the rhythm of situations changing around and not only in the front of the audience. The important difference between this project, especially this one, and Grotowski's proposition is that both these projects were full of modern technology with moving platforms and revolving stage, while Grotowski proposed something very poor. And I'm using this word, sacral word poor, consciously. In fact, I think that his propositions were closer to the poor version of simultaneous theater proposed or composed by Helena and Szymon Syrkus for the Warsaw Żeromski Theater Studio. It was the Żeromski Theater was the one exception that I mentioned before, because this is the only interwar theater that Grotowski mentioned in his texts as his own tradition, but he never explained why. He just 2 or 3 times mentioned that beside Reduta there is also Żeromski theater as an important tradition. I suppose that it was because of this design for the Boston, based on the play by Bernard Bloom. But the important thing is that before it was staged, Żeromski Theater organized his own studio. It was very interesting theater. Maybe someday we will have more time to talk about it. It was led by a famous modernist actress Irena Solska, and because it was led by women, it was neglected for many years in the theater history in Poland, because you know, Solska was a star, and no one believed for years that she was able to have some avant-garde serious ideas, which she really had. When she organized the studio for the theater, she invited Helena and Szymon Syrkus to rebuild the room. The studio was organized in the former heating hall of the building downstairs. And of course, they didn't have enough money to organize something technologically expensive. So they proposed a very simple and very cheap solution. They covered, or rather built the floor of a room with wooden blocks 200 centimeters high and 19 centimeters wide that could be joined together in such a way that you can build out of them different platforms around the room. And the platforms could be used as a performance spaces and also as a spaces for the audience. There was no permanent stage in the room. For each of the performance, they were able to organize the space as they wanted to. And it was both for the performance, for performers and for the spectators. Unfortunately, the only performance that was staged in this space was this premiere of the Boston. As we, I suppose, can see on this slide, the director Michał Weichert, with help of Circus, created in the room several performing spaces in different parts of the room, allowing the viewers to watch the action and themselves from different perspectives. And what is important, the viewers were allowed to change their places in the intermission between acts. If they don't like the place they sat, they can move to another place. Working in a theater of 13 rows, later called the Laboratory Theater, Grotowski used quite similar principles and solutions, starting from Shakuntala in 1960. As you see, he tried to create this front and back stage. These were the places for the audience, and there were platforms for actors commenting what was going on the central stage. So some parts of the action were taking place behind the spectators, and at certain points also the spectators were engaged in the action, performing the supporters of protagonists. But what is important that for each new production, Grotowski created not only the stage design, but the new space with a new dramaturgy, gradually immersing the spectator into the performance world. And in my opinion, the far-reaching experiment in this aspect was done for the production of Kordian, based by romantic drama written by Juliusz Słowacki. The drama was written in 1833, and it's a biography of a young, sensible man rebelling against the world that is ruled by evil. In one of the scenes in the third act, the hero is jailed in the mental hospital ruled by the diabolic doctor. Grotowski used this scene as the frame for the whole performance. The scenes taken from the drama, the stages of Kordian's life journey, were performed as the illusions and hallucinations of a young hero. The romantic poetic vision were confronted with the bitter and cruel reality of the hospital and with rational, pragmatic and cold logic of a doctor, performed by Zygmunt Molling. And here you get Zbigniew Cinkutis performing Kordian on this high installation. The starting point for the space design was clear. Grotowski was to build the room in the mental hospital. There was no place for an abstract sculpture here, so he used the real destroyed poor objects, the old metal beds, some of them taken from the mental hospital. However, these found objects, and in fact, Grotowski was using the strategy of Kantor. He used poor, destroyed, found objects, but they were used in a special way. They became the elements of a special installation that has its own dramaturgy. Some of the beds were put one upon another, creating multi-level structures used both by actors and by spectators. The relations between the two groups changed radically. Some members of the audience were literally not able to see the action taking place above them. Of course, the girls sitting there, they could watch the actresses, but they never watched what was the doctor doing above them. They only hear some noises, something was going on, but they were not able to see it. The same happened with the actions performed in another part of the room. It's very funny because most of the pictures we have are from Kraków, from Cristofori Gallery. That was the place for Kantor's performances, and they used it while they were presenting Kordian during the guest performances in Kraków. And the legend says that Kantor didn't allow it, and he got furious when he learned that Grotowski performed in Cristofori. I must say, I don't believe it. I don't believe the story. I think it's a legend. So there is another link between Kantor and Grotowski. But when you read the reviews and descriptions of the performance, you can quite easily see that there was a serious trouble with seeing the action, because this construction obscures the view from some part of the audience. Some spectators were not able to see what is going on. As a result, these spectators were forced to use another senses. In this way, Grotowski managed to return to this initial idea of the intuition space. The small theater room was packed with objects and people, accompanying the actors to perform very close to the audience. The proximity of the performers and the spectators consequently created a special effect of reality, no matter how poetic the words and how unrealistic the actions. The materiality of the body was felt and smelled also in a most concrete way, fueling the important tension between romantic poetry and psychology, that was physiology, that was very important for this performance. This slide is weak, so you cannot see, but there are the spots of sweat on the actor's dress. And there are another photos from the performance that can clearly see that this room packed with people caused the bodies of the actors sweat a lot. So of course the audience felt this smell and so on. So it was very material, and for the whole experience of the performance of this highly poetical romantic drama, I think it was very important. Another clear example of experiments with this magic space of intuition, as Grotowski called it, can be found in the production of Tragical History of Dr. Faustus, which premiered in April 1963, based, of course, on a drama by Christopher Marlowe. On one hand, the situation and space designed for Faustus was analogical to the situation and space in Kordian. Again, Grotowski, and this is the trick that he used many times, took one scene from the drama as a frame for a whole action. In this case, it was the final scene of Marlowe's tragedy when Faustus invites his students to join him on a supper, and in fact it's his last supper just before he is taken to hell by devil. And Grotowski used it, of course, because it's a last supper, and this, let's say, evangelical analogy was important for him, but also he used it as a model or frame for the dramaturgy of the performance, because during the performance Faustus served the fragments of his life, performing it on these tables. So the whole space was transformed into a kind of modest refectory in a monastery, and the spectators were the guests of the Last Supper of a hero. But what was very clever in this concept is that Grotowski created very high wooden tables and benches for spectators. So, the action was performed on these tables very close to the spectators. Among them there were two actors, as seen on this picture, and the whole construction seems very stable, very heavy and massive. But in certain points it occurred that these tables are moving, and from above something is emerging. And what was very strange for the spectators is a kind of use of this sphere of intuition, because around this refectory, let's say, there was a wooden fence. And at the very beginning it seems that it's just a border between the rest of the room and the performing space. But slowly it occurred that behind this wooden fence there is something. Because when people were sitting there, they heard strange noises coming from behind. Suddenly they heard a song sung from this, behind this fence. And the devil came out of this sphere. So the experience for the spectators was like they were surrounded by a space full of strange creatures, strange noises, maybe the sphere of devils. And of course, they were not able to see what was going on there. They can only hear, feel, be moved by what was going on. So the work of Górowski and Grotowski in this context should be seen and interpreted not as a stage design, but as a work on the spatial dramaturgy of the theatrical and performative event. Together they change the performance space from something in which the performance is put, like in a box, into an active performative environment or even a non-human co-performer. And this was the same idea that inspired and fueled many avant-garde attempts. Ironically, what was envisioned as the technologically rich was achieved in a poor, substantial theater. And another link that I would like to propose and reflect upon joins Grotowski and probably the most extraordinary figure of Polish avant-garde, the painter, the philosopher, the thinker, the pioneer of performance art, Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz. I suppose that for many of you this link may seem eccentric because Witkiewicz, of course, is strongly connected to Tadeusz Kantor, who staged his dramas and used it as a material for his happening. But my hypothesis is that for Grotowski, Witkiewicz was the hidden but very important inspiration. In his widely discussed manifesto, The Introduction to the Theory of Pure Form in Theatre, Witkacy wrote that his main goal was to achieve the situation of free manipulation of all the elements of the work of art, including the ones that are considered realistic. He proposed to break out from the rules of a psychological consequence and consistence of a character and action, and from the dogma of probability, even to the stage of nonsense of becoming, as he said. Instead, he postulated the total freedom of artists creating the work that would be ruled only by the formal logic of inner stage construction. The pure form is not, as it's sometimes naively seen, as a pure nonsense or an abstract play. It results from the ambition to free ourselves from the outer conditions restricting the acts of knowing and communication. Witkacy was strongly against the theatre understood, as in the 19th century, as the reproduction mirroring any known or imagined but probable reality. Rather, he dreamed about theatre becoming an independent tool of knowledge, crossing the borders of any acceptable one. Such theatre would be the last possible domain of experiencing what the artist called the mystery of existence, and what can be understood as the knowledge reaching to or coming from a realm lying behind the horizon of the theatre of everyday life. This experience is crucial as one of the last means of saving the metaphysical emotions that Witkacy considered to vanish from modern, more and more mechanized life of social masses. He tried to save the theatre from the reproduction of the already known because only as such it can work as the tool of true research of the unknown. The destruction of all mimetic and reproductive patterns created in the course of history was supposed to open a possibility of real theatre research, but result had to be unpredictable. In the very last sentence of the introduction to the theory of pure form in theatre, Witkacy said, "We need to unchain the sleeping beast and see what it will do. And if it will get mad, there still will be enough time to shut it down." Witkiewicz, as all true avant-gardists, did not know where his experiment can lead to. He didn't know because what can be known depends on already existing forms ruled by conventions and social control. Whereas for Witkacy, the art was the vehicle, and again I'm using this phrase consciously, allowing to discover the crucial value of human life experience in the moments of special intensity of being. Grotowski had never staged any of Witkac's play, so few times he declared that he intended to, especially at the very beginning of his career. For sure, he knew Witkiewicz's work, and Ludwig Flaschen, a long-time collaborator of Grotowski, said that they were reading Witkacy all the time. But what seems more important is that his theater can be considered as the realization of the theory of the pure form, of course, in different historical context. The short description of the main theater idea of Witkacy, of course, it was short and simplified, but I think the most important point were there. This description given above can be read as the description of the main idea of Grotowski. He also broke out with the mimetism, and his performances were ruled only by their inner logic. Like Witkacy, Grotowski was radical and consequent in his experiments, thus the name laboratory added to the name of the theater around 1962. And like Witkacy, he considered the art to be the last domain of metaphysical experiences. However, unlike Witkacy, Grotowski has the stage and his own company at his disposal, so he was able to test and develop his theories in practice. Despite this difference, or rather thanks to it, Grotowski's theater can be regarded as the realization of Witkiewicz's idea of a future theater of mystery of existence. The connection with Witkiewicz I have just tried to draw is just one example of the links between Grotowski and the avant-garde in the context of dramaturgy, again understood in a wide sense of the word, not restricted to drama as a text for theater. Today, Grotowski's role as the pioneer of contemporary dramaturgy is slightly forgotten, so it is worth to recall it. It is clear that Grotowski was one of those theater artists who rebelled against the rule of literature. From the very beginning, even as a director in the repertory drama theater in Krakow between 1957 and 1959, he intervened strongly in the texts he was staging. Soon he simply stopped to stage a drama, instead creating his own textual montages based only on existing texts, and sometimes he even used the phrase that scenario is by Grotowski and the words are by Wyspiański, Mickiewicz, and so on. Later, step by step, he was going more and more away from the text. Finally, in his last performance, Apocalypsis cum Figuris, entirely resigning from it and creating the performance by editing the sequences created out of the actors' improvisations. Breaking the contact between the stage and the page, Grotowski was searching for some alternative dramaturgical models different from the classical Aristotelian one. That is why he valued Polish romantic drama so highly, calling in one of his texts, The Forefather's Eve by Adam Mickiewicz, the model of contemporary theater. That is why, on the other hand, he used the conventions of non-drama performances, especially cabaret. It can be seen clearly in the earliest performances of the theater of 13 Rows, like Cain, based on George Byron's poetical drama, or Buffo Mysteries, based on two of Władimir Majakowski's plays. What is interesting, both these traditions, the romantic drama and the cabaret, were used by Polish avant-garde. The first one is quite well known. I think that during one of our meetings I was telling you the story of the problems with Polish avant-garde that was using the classical canonical text, because our canonical text, the romantic drama by Mickiewicz, Słowacki, Norwid, and so on, was regarded, and truly they are, non-conventional dramas. They are, in fact, to use Hans Zimmer's term, post-dramatical text for theater rather than dramas. So at the very beginning of 20th century, exactly 100 years ago, the young artists were quite convinced that to create the national drama, we need to stage these poetical texts, but it's impossible with the usage of conventional realistic drama theater. It is possible only with the means and propositions taken from the avant-garde. And this was, it was proved especially by Leon Schiller and Andrzej Pronaszko, of course, in their famous staging The Forefather's Eve, inspired by Cubism and Constructivism, and it's a let's say, paradigmatical staging for so-called Polish monumental theater. And it was highly acclaimed and accepted. I think it's one of the most rare examples in which the avant-garde strategies are accepted not only by the audience but also by the government and some ministries and so on and so on and so on. That's why Schiller, who was the communist, was sent to Paris to stage Szymanowski's ballet as a representative of right-wing conservative government. The idea of the avant-garde nature of Polish national drama was, as I said, close to Grotowski, though his relation towards this drama was not the one of cult, but the one of profanation and blasphemy, which is clearly seen in this picture of the national hero Konrad taking pose of Jesus Christ during his passion, but without the cross, but with a broom on his shoulders. But the connection with the avant-garde alternative and critical form of artistic cabaret or even circus is not so obvious. But when you look closer at the performances and texts written by Grotowski in the beginning of 1960s, the Theatre of 13 Rows used the dramaturgy of cabaret shows quite often. And I think it's the motivation or the cause for it is similar to the diagnosis that the philosopher and painter Leon Kwistek, a great friend of Witkacy, formulated in his article with a title that seems written for our conference because it's titled The Theatre of the Future. The text was written in 1922. Kwistek postulated the radical destruction of the classical drama unities by the performance in which, and this is the quotation, all the scenes should be created in such a way that the aesthetical value of each of them was independent of the value and meaning of the rest. Despite of it, they all should create an unified whole. And as a model of such theatre, Kwistek proposed the revue, cabaret, or variété, suggesting that by using the dramaturgy of numbers and the montage of attractions, the new type of non-entertaining and non-commercial performance can be created. Some other avant-garde artists proposed to use another non-dramatical models, both historical, like Commedia dell'arte, or contemporary, like Dadaism, and this connection was used by Cricot, about which Karolina Czerska is going to talk tomorrow. But all these artists, and it's important, were engaged in the creation of a performance that would not be the representation of any lifelike events, but would be ruled by the inner logic of an experience that is not possible outside the theatre. Because of that, both the dramaturgy of the historical avant-garde and of the Grotowski's theatres can be interpreted and analyzed as a dramaturgy of experience, the performative practice that aim is not to create the piece of work of a stage art to be watched, but instead the effect to affect the audience through the series of composed experiences. All these artists wanted to confront their contemporary public with the questions and doubts we used to run away from in our everyday life. The theatre was not created to be read and understood, but to become the space of personal, individual, and collective experiences, finally resulting in the change of the light on the life outside the stage. And I try to show the last slide. This ambition to change the world through art was common both to the avant-gardists and to Grotowski. And despite the differences in the direction of the change, what they also had in common was the belief that the theatre, as the separated domain of the cultural life, loses its importance and value. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now I think we can discuss further on these two artists and about the links and hidden or unthought bridges between the historical avant-garde and the continuation of the ideas and the possibility of realization or impossibility of realization of the ideas of historical avant-garde, and maybe even start to think about the present and the future of the theater, because that is also one of the points of our conference, the link between the historical avant-gardes and the possible inspirations towards some theater of the future and the contemporary theater. And what I heard in both of these presentations is something which sounds very familiar nowadays with the concept of participatory theater and immersive theater, the link between audience and the artists. So maybe you have some questions for Justyna or for Dariusz.
I have comment. I
Or
think we
comment.
should direct think about some kind of project or seminar to discuss about Grotowski, Kantor, Kwistek, Witracy,
and Gombrowicz.
Gombrowicz.
I would add Gombrowicz to this list. Yeah.
I have a question, because I see the link between Konaszko, Kwistek, Witkiewicz, Grotowski, Kantor in one way, but I think that Szymon Syrkus, I think he doesn't fit so well into this configuration.
Mm-hmm.
Because especially in the fact that the simultaneous theater, as well as Boston, it was a theater for workers, worker theater, and the Teatr Żeromskiego was meant to be a part of a Warsaw housing cooperative.
And was, in fact.
And it was, in fact, which was meant to be, according to Corbusier ideas, a whole organism for Red Żoliborz, for the communist Żoliborz district. So I think this ideology behind Szymon Syrkus and behind Boston, which was in fact a story of Sacco and Vanzetti, like the two American, two Italians who have been sentenced to death by capitalists. Yeah. So this, I think, do not really fit to this configuration, like this ideological background of Syrkus and his idea of the theater as a part of the organism, as it was like the district of Żoliborz.
So I'm responding immediately. It fits because of that ideology. Grotowski is the author of the text. I like this text very much, and it is titled "Civilization and Freedom. There is no other socialism." He was active in a revolutionary socialistic movement after Stalin's death. For more than a year, he was, as they called him, the angry revolutionary. His friend from this time, Karol Modzelewski, the famous historian and opposition activist, recalls that if Soviets would invade Poland in the time, the first man to be shot was Grotowski, because he was so revolutionary. And even later, before he started all this anthropological research, he was very interested in the idea of popular theater. Again, it's under research, and this is something that I'm going to do in future. They organized in Opole special performances for workers. They traveled with the performances. Of course, it was inspired by the idea of Jean Villard. They were traveling to industry towns around Opole, to factories, performing there, and not performing only some, let's say, documentary drama that they created, but also performing Shakuntala and for the Forefathers' Eve for workers. So he never went so far as they went on Żoliborz, on creating the special arts center, let's say. And of course, the context was different. Because when the socialism was forced upon the society, then it was not so, it was very ambivalent to act this way. But he admitted there is a very strange article published in Italian press when Grotowski was touring in Italy, in Venice, in the dance Italian the journalist meets Grotowski and they start to talk, and Grotowski says, if I was Italian, I will be communist, because I'm communist in my heart, but I cannot be communist in today's Poland. So I think that this ideology was quite close to him. And of course, because of a historical context, it was different, but still there was something in common.
Yeah, because I didn't know this Grotowski like staged co-workers. I think it's important also to know this. But I think like the simultaneous theater was also a propaganda theater, which I think was not much into what Grotowski and Kantor wanted. However, I think this background is also, I think, very, very interesting about the socialist ideology also in the mind of Grotowski, which I didn't know. So I think it's
I think it's very important, especially in Polish, but not only in Polish context, this ideological background of historical avant-garde, that the neo-avant-garde had a lot of problems with. Yes, they somehow accepted the artistic solutions, but the ideology out of which these solutions were grown, this was highly problematic after the Second World War.
Yeah, especially after Poland became
communist.
Yes. So yeah. It was like more the utopia of circles.
Any other questions or comments?
Thank you both. I just was curious about going back to Reduta just for a moment. And Dariusz, the comment you made I thought was interesting was that they did some avant-garde work, or that they did a bit of that. And I wonder about that, about what kind of, when we think about the avant-garde and notions of commitment, about what does it mean for a group to dabble and come back out. You know, I mean, both in terms of identification, but really in terms of ideas of commitment being a core of what an avant-garde forms, or what its potentialities are.
They did one performance that can be called avant-gardistic, let's say. It was called The Strange Street by Kazimierz Czyżewski, the unknown, forgotten drama. They staged it in 1923, and it was designed by, gosh, I forgot the name, oh my God, I remember, by Adam Dobrodziejski. An avant-garde painter, a very strange and fascinating figure. And Osterwa invited him, and they made even a kind of casting for the text, because before they decided to stage The Strange Street, they also read Witkacy. I don't remember which drama. Maybe it was a New Deliverance. But they decided to take Czyżewski instead. Why? Because, of course, they weren't committed to avant-garde. They were not. Their thinking was not avant-gardistic. They were rather for discovering the hidden sources of human creativity, coming back to the sources of theater, to ritual, and so on and so on. But at a certain point, Osterwa decided that they need to cleanse themselves from the realistic conventions. Because the idea of Reduta was, we are starting with realistic theater, we need to teach our actors how to perform psychological characters on the stage, and then we will move towards the romantic mysteries. And at a certain point he discovered that all these realistic conventions were so deeply rooted in actors' work that he needed to propose to his actors something totally different, to clean them. So they used avant-garde performance as a way of cleaning. Another thing is that Reduta is, it is very strange, because next year there will be a centenary of the theater, and it seems that there is a lot of things done around Reduta, a lot of books and so on, but we still don't know much about the precise way of creating each of the performances. And I think that there are some performances, like for example Judas, that include some avant-garde elements in set design, in the way the actors were acting on the stage. So they were somehow inspired by avant-garde. They were watching the performances. Osterwa knew Witkacy very well, and of course Pronaszko and so on and so on. The circle of theater people was not so big, so everybody knew it, everybody. So they were somehow inspired, and they took some elements of the avant-garde for their performances. But as I said, the core was not avant-garde at all, of course.
Someone else?
I have a question. My question is connected with the end of talking between Dariusz and Przemysław, because I'm really interested in why, when we speak about avant-garde, mostly we speak about aesthetic dimension, and almost do not speak about this ideological background of political circumstances and ideological differences of different places, because I think it's also important when we try to look for avant-garde and to try to understand what it is. So my question, why?
My answer is simple. I was not talking about it today, simply because it's half an hour, and I just wanted to put some, points for the discussion. But when you look on, especially, I'm not an expert of an international research on avant-garde, but when you look at the Polish research on the avant-garde, these problems were discussed. And there are many very, very good books on the ideology of the avant-garde. The problem now is that I feel in Poland when there is a tendency to omit this ideology because it's not very trendy to speak positively about socialism and communism. And of course it's stupid. But there is something in the air. So I think that maybe some people are not dealing with this subject because of this atmosphere that the red is bad. Maybe that's why. But still, we have a lot of studies concerning this. And in the case of Grotowski, this is the point that they commented by themselves. There is an important essay by Ludwig Flaschen that is called "After the Avant-Garde," in which he says that something like that the avant-garde with its social utopias was not successful because it was naive. And now we are after the disasters that the avant-garde was afraid of, so we need to take another direction. So what he proposes is exactly to take some points from the avant-garde, but to move with them towards another direction. And this essay was written in late 1960s. And maybe this is the time for the change. The last year's conference, as some of you may remember, finished with a performance by Komuna Warszawa, the 7 songs on the avant-garde, in which Grzegorz Laszuk, who is somehow a disappointed revolutionary, stated very clearly and very directly that now we need the avant-garde because of ideological background of it. Because we need to change the world and we need to come back to the avant-garde. So I think that the times change and soon we will have a new wave of the reflection on the ideological background of the avant-garde.
There is one more comment. I think we are slowly approaching the end of this panel.
Just to follow up on that briefly, I think when we're talking about the politics of the avant-garde, it's often not really adequate just to say socialist or communist. That very many of the avant-garde figures, not only in Poland, not only in Europe, would be identified with one or other varieties of what we might call ultra-left. and be it council communism or anarchism, or people influenced by situationist theories. And these tendencies are not, and the right wing would just tend to lump them in with Stalinism and so on, and Stalinism would tend to tend either to incorporate them and ignore the differences, or to denounce them as bourgeois deviations. So there's a complexity there that is probably not accessible to a lot of the people who are primarily concerned with artistic activity. You need to know the history and the philosophy and the practical actions taken by political tendencies, especially from the 1920s and the 1960s.
I absolutely agree, and I think that this is the field to be researched right now, because we are looking for alternatives, and I believe that there are many inspirations of such alternatives in the historical avant-garde. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I think also that it's an area which is especially problematic for Central and Eastern Europe, especially the ideology, because when you think about like leftist neo-avant-garde outside of Central Eastern Europe, like that ideology, it's not problematic. But here you have like this Grotowski who is communist inside, but he's not doing propaganda. So because he lives in a country which is communist. And I think this is like very important when we think about our region.
I think ideological background is a large topic and raises many questions, but I think our time is slowly approaching to the pause. So maybe I will ask if there is some more questions, maybe the last question or a comment, and we can then have a short pause before another part of ours.
I could have another brief one, unrelated
sure.
topic. This is for both of you. Do you think there were some important potential developments in Polish theatre in the 1920s, 1930s that were not picked up on by Grotowski, Kantor, and everybody else? Are there some nuggets there that can be developed that nobody has grabbed yet?
You know, our Czech colleagues are laughing at us, saying that we didn't have any serious avant-garde, because also this case that we were presenting the same slides is the proof, but the archive is not so big. But I think that there are. For example, I'm quite fascinated with the idea and practice of Witold Wandurski, another communist director and writer, who developed the theory of new theater created out of the needs of the new audience. And of course he meant the workers. But what is interesting, and it's not new, but what is interesting is the practice of creation of this new theater, because he proposed something that I would dare to call queering or queerness of conventions of bourgeois theater. He used the word. In Polish, it's wypaczać, and I think to queer, it's the best translation. Because what he proposed is, we are using a very well-known structures and performances and scripts from the folk theater, but we are queering them in such a way that the audience is the source of this queering. We are staging something, and the audience says and acts and takes the stage slowly. And I think that no one used this proposition until now, and it wasn't developed in such a way. And there are also some I would say, hidden elements, like Dobrodziejski's text, for example, very interesting ones. So, yeah, there's still something to be done.
I think also the short dramas by Jerzy, for example.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Because they were modeled on futurist theater, and they were like 10 minutes long or 5 minutes long. So, yeah, I think this also was not a part of Kantor.
I really don't want to interrupt this discussion because it's very interesting, but I think I have to thank our presenters, and we will see each other at 6:30.
6:30, it's room in the same building, it's G10.
10.
So yes, we have a short break now. Hope we'll meet.